Chapter 7, Section 1. Types of memories developed through neuroplasticity. In this brief chapter, we are going to discuss how all of our different memories develop in our brain through a very important but complex natural process that neuroscience experts refer to as neuroplasticity. This very same process has also developed our brains to be unique and separates us humans from all other species of life here on Earth, and also defines us all as individuals, especially because neuroplasticity is the only process that allows us to store all of our different personal information into our long-term memories. And our long-term memories is the main memory that we all continue to recall throughout our lives. All of our different personal information, our personal emotions, personal knowledge, personal skills, personal learning, personal languages, and all personal emotional intelligence. Therefore, our long-term memories is in control of most of our personal behaviours, personal thought patterns, personal logic, personal rationale, personal decisions, personal reasoning, and most of our personal reactions. However, unfortunately, neuroplasticity is also the process that has also stored all of our different, very early childhood, involuntary ego emotions that most of us were unaware of throughout our childhood, developed and stored throughout all of these different, very early childhood, involuntary emotional events. And that is why, whenever we are upset, angry, stressed, in fear, hurt, hate, or having any other different ego emotional wounds or suffering, our long-term memories recalls our ego emotions and reacts so that neuroplasticity continues to trigger, activate, and store more ego emotions into our long-term memories. Imagine now if we all found the solutions to begin storing some brand new voluntary emotions into our long-term memories. In other words, these voluntary emotions meant that we would all know that we were storing these new emotions into our long-term memories. But this time, these new emotions were only for our highest and greatest good of our own positive and peaceful, highly evolved, altruistic, rational and logical emotional intelligence. In other words, they were not involuntary emotions, but voluntary emotions that we all became aware of developing into our long-term memories. This is why it is important for us to understand how this complex process, neuroplasticity, develops our memories. Because once we begin to understand a little about neuroplasticity, in the second half of this book, we will be explaining how voluntary neuroplasticity can help us all in the future to develop 3 brand new levels of emotional adaptation that will be developed only for our highest and greatest good, to bring us all a brand new, higher sense of wellness, blissful happiness and healing within ourselves. But these are simply the beginning of these brand new emotional adaptations, because these emotions can literally transform ourselves and our fragile earth through our highly evolved altruistic emotions and behaviours of the collective consciousness, so that we can all begin to live a collective, pure and beautiful, positive and peaceful life with each other and for all generations to come, so that we can all finally begin to live a life that feels like paradise here on earth. This will be the discussions for the second half of this book, but before we begin these very important and life-changing discussions, we need to first understand a little bit about how we are all going to get there. In other words, how neuroplasticity holds most of these solutions. Therefore, we need to understand a little bit about this very complex but very important natural process, neuroplasticity, that's in charge of developing all of our different memories, our short-term memory, that's also called our working memory, and our long-term memory, because these are all memories that store all of our different personal information. When we go to bed at night and fall into a deep, calm, relaxing sleep, sometimes we may dream a little, but most of the time our brains shut down, and when we wake up in the morning, we don't have to start all over again and put back all the memory from all of the past day or past months or past years that we have lived, because we have kept most of this important information stored in our long-term memories that even dates right back since our very early childhoods, ego emotions that most of us were unaware of. And that is why when we wake up in the morning, we simply carry on with all of this stored information that we have already obtained and stored into our long-term memories. So how does neuroplasticity take this information and store this information into our memories? Remember that we all have many different memories in our brain, and as you will soon discover in the second half of this book, one of these memories, our working memory, has the capacity to help us all in the future, but only through exploiting this extremely important natural neural process in our brain, neuroplasticity. Because neuroplasticity is the exact same process that has enabled us all to develop all of the history of our personal information, including all of our individual happy emotional events that we can all still remember, even today. We can all easily try this ourselves. Try to recall and remember a happy event in your life, and try to reflect on that happy moment in your life. How did it make you feel? We all have some wonderful happy memories stored in our long-term memories, and many of these memories will last a lifetime. This is why there is an old saying that mentions that we cannot take material possessions with us when we leave this fragile earth. All we can take is our most important and happiest memories. And this is why our lives are nothing else but our memories. This is why it's important for many of us to now recognise how this very important yet complex natural process, neuroplasticity, can help us all in the future. In the index, you will find many more details regarding this complex process, neuroplasticity, and how neurons are the initial activation that allows this process, neuroplasticity, to begin, and what 3 types of neurons we have all obtained. Because without neurons, we couldn't process any information. Therefore, we wouldn't have any memories. Therefore, without our different memories, our brains wouldn't be able to function to create all the enormous multitude of tasks that we all perform throughout our busy and hectic everyday lives. We know this because the most tragic event that can ever happen to a person is the loss of memory. And if you have ever known anyone who is suffering from dementia, Alzheimer's, or any similar disease that is connected to loss of memory, we begin to recognise that our human memories is who we become. Because it becomes our personalities, it becomes the spirit of a person, becomes our long-term memories, and how our long-term memories has stored all personal information since our very early childhoods, as we have already discussed in many previous chapters. Therefore, loss of memory is the most tragic event that can ever happen to a person. Our long-term memories are the largest storage memory organ in our brain. Because all personal information, including all of our very earliest unknown, personal, involuntary, childhood, ego emotional information that stems right back since our very early childhoods, becomes stored into our long-term memories. However, our brains are a little more complex than this and relies on many different types of memory to store information that many neuroscience experts have located in different areas in our brain. There are several different types of memories, some of which are short-term, known as our working memory, and some last a lifetime, such as our long-term memories. And then we have our ancient ancestors' primitive genetic memory, the amygdala, that has not yet been recognised by many neuroscience experts as a memory. Below you will find a small paragraph found through independent scientific coursework that states the importance of our amygdala as a memory. Amygdala. The amygdala, an almond-shaped structure in the brain's temporal lobe, attaches emotional significance to memories. This is particularly important because strong emotional memories, for example, those associated with shame, joy, love, or grief, are difficult to forget. The permanence of these memories suggests that interactions between the amygdala, hippocampus, and neocortex are crucial in determining the stability of a memory. That is, how effectively it is retained over time. There's an additional aspect to the amygdala's involvement in memory. The amygdala doesn't just modify the strength and emotional content of memories, it also plays a key role in forming new memories, specifically related to fear. Fearful memories are able to be formed after only a few repetitions. When we talk about remembering things, we usually refer to explicit memory, and explicit memories can be either episodic, meaning that it relates to experiences or episodes in our life, for example, the first time you kissed a girl or a boy, or fell off your bike, etc. Or they are semantic memory, relating to facts or general knowledge. This is why neuroscience and the neuroanatomy of our human brain and what becomes stored into different areas in our brain is an extremely complex subject, and that is why I greatly admire all neuroscience experts who sometimes spend an entire lifetime studying one particular area that can be found in our human brain. This is how extremely complex our human brains really are, and even though most neuroscience experts would say that they still haven't discovered all of the complex aspects of our human brain and how they function, they are more close to understanding that our brains function more through networks rather than individual areas independently. I would entirely agree with this, having spent a lifetime studying our own human emotional behavioural patterns, including my own, because this is how we have all remained in similar patterns of emotional behaviours as our ancestors. The reason for this certainty is that the most highly influential of all of our emotional behaviours is the development of our own individual and different illogical, irrational, personal, ego, fear or hurt emotions that has become involuntarily and unknowingly stored into our long-term memories, and that first became involuntarily activated through our heart and gut emotional senses throughout our very early childhood emotional events, without most of us even knowing. These are the most highly influential because they are our very earliest stored personal emotions, all developed through the help of involuntary neuroplasticity. This is how all of our different personal adult ego behavioural patterns have become the most highly influential, and how, through neural networks, they can influence all other emotional behaviours found in other areas in our brain, such as the activation of our genetic emotions that we discussed in chapters 5 and 6, and can even suppress many of our highly evolved altruistic emotions that we are going to discuss throughout the second half of this book, section 2. This very small paragraph above is an extremely simplified version of how neuroplasticity has developed and stored all of our different emotions through millions of different neurons firing up to create new neural networks to be formed in different areas in our brain. So let's get down to a few scientific details of how neuroplasticity began to store all of our different involuntary, unrecognised and unwanted childhood, illogical, irrational, personal, ego, fear or hurt emotions to become stored into our long-term memories. The term is derived from the root word neuron, the nerve cell in our brain, and plastic, having the power of moulding or receiving form. In other words, nerve cells fuse together to form new neural pathways made up of axons and dendrites, and these link to one another through a small space called a synapse. However, most of our unwanted and unrecognised ego emotions that we all began to store into our long-term memories came from unknown, involuntary emotional reactions through our very early childhood emotional events that most of us were unaware of. In other words, before our very young brains could begin to fuse and build these new neural pathways, the brain must have first found an emotion, because it is our very early childhood emotions and feelings that create the spark that triggers neuroplasticity to begin in the first place, and that these very early childhood unknown emotions and feelings first became triggered through an involuntary connection between our heart and gut senses that would then activate a new involuntary neural connection that allowed this involuntary emotion to become stored into our long-term memories. And each time we had a strong feeling or emotion through an unknown childhood emotional event, our heart and gut emotional senses triggered a new synapse to initiate a new neural connection to fuse together to become stored into our long-term memories. However, let me remind you that all of this was happening in our very early childhoods when none of us knew what was happening, because all of us simply functioned through our heart and gut senses. Because when we were all very young children, our hearts were the gateway to our souls. And when we were all very young children, all of our hearts were innocent, pure, and beautiful. This above is a simplified version of what happens in our brain, because our brains are a little more complex than this, because certain areas in our brains activates different information, as you will discover in the index. However, in general, neurons are specialized cells that transmit chemical and electrical signals in the brain. They are the basic building blocks of the central nervous system. And neuroplasticity is a process that occurs between our brains and bodies that initially begins with these neurons made up of axons and dendrites. And once millions of neurons are firing up, they fuse to create new synapses. And once these new synapses have formed, a new neural pathway has developed. This is why neuroplasticity is a term that neuroscience experts use to identify how different information forms new neural connections and can store this different information throughout our lives through particular neurons involved. Because, as mentioned in the index, there are 3 types of neurons. However, to map out where these new neural connections end up is an extremely complex process, because there are millions of neurons that need to fire up in our brains to make up new neural networks in our brain. And to find out where all these networks are coming and going is an extremely complex procedure that neuroscience experts are still currently working on discovering. Below you will find a small paragraph given through independent scientific coursework that can be found in the index. Historically, it was generally thought that the role of the synapse was to simply transfer information between one neuron and another neuron, or between a neuron and a muscle cell. In addition, it was thought that these connections, once established during development, were relatively fixed in their strength, much like a solder joint between 2 electronic components. One exciting development in neurobiology over the past 40 years is the realization that most synapses are extremely plastic. They are able to change their strength as a result of either their own activity or through activity in another pathway. Many think that this synaptic plasticity is central to understanding the mechanisms of learning and memory. There are 2 general forms of synaptic plasticity, intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic mechanisms, also known as homosynaptic mechanisms, refer to changes in the strength of a synapse that are brought about by its own activity. Extrinsic plasticity, or heterosynaptic plasticity, is a change in the strength of a synapse brought about by activity in another pathway. Neuroplasticity, or synaptic plasticity, is an extremely complex set of activities because, as mentioned earlier, it all begins with a neuron, and all neurons are divided into 3 neuron types based on their function: sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. There are currently many ego-contentious discussions throughout the scientific community that debate that neurons are generated by neural stem cells during brain development and childhood. Also, that neurogenesis largely ceases during adulthood in most brain areas. On the other hand, there has also been other independent scientific research studies that support evidence that new neurons are generated in the hippocampus and olfactory bulb in adulthood. After searching to try to find some of this independent scientific research evidence, in order to help us all to understand how neurons first begin to be generated, I have been unsuccessful, simply because many of these findings up to now have been based on animal testing and animal experiments, and as I explained in earlier chapters, I am strongly against animal suffering for our own human benefits, simply to help us to find these scientific answers regarding our own human brain's development. Therefore, I have not included many of these independent scientific research studies in the index. Instead, I approach this dilemma in the opposite direction, through spending most of my life studying my own and other emotional behaviours, and I came to my own conclusions that, since the day we were all first born until the day we all die, all of our personal information becomes stored into our long-term memories, beginning with all of our very earliest childhood involuntary, unknown, illogical, irrational, personal, ego, fear or hurt emotions, and from the age of approximately 3 to 5 years old and throughout our adult lives, we all begin to also store all other personal information, such as our personal knowledge, personal learning, personal skills, personal emotional intelligence, all personal logic and rational, and all personal events that have happened throughout our lives. This is why all information stored in our long-term memories controls our behaviours, our thought patterns, our reasoning, our decisions, and most of our reactions. This is why neurons must have become generated through neural stem cells during the brain development and childhood, because neurons becomes the very first initial methods that develop any new childhood emotional information to become stored into our long-term memories since babies and throughout all of our childhood. This is why independent scientific experts are correct. Neurons are generated by neural stem cells during brain development and childhood, but neurons are also generated in the hippocampus and olfactory bulb in adulthood, because the hippocampus is the area in our brain associated with the development of our long-term memories. And as mentioned many times, our long-term memories is where we store all of our personal information throughout our lives. And this is why it is my firm belief that we are all very capable of generating new neurons to become stored into our long-term memories, even into our old age. Because in adulthood, our long-term memories never stop storing all involuntary and all voluntary personal information. It's simply a question of what information we all personally want our long-term memories to store. In other words, are you in charge of the information you store in your memory, or do you want your memory to simply continue to store more involuntary ego fears, more upset, more stress, more anxieties, and many more ego emotional wounds and suffering? In other words, are you ready to take back control of the information that is stored in your long-term memory? If so, then you will need to continue to the second half of this book, section 2, when we will all begin to discuss the huge attributes of voluntary neuroplasticity. So what's the difference between involuntary neuroplasticity and voluntary neuroplasticity? Involuntary means that we didn't know what was happening. In other words, we didn't know that we were storing all of these different childhood, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions into our long-term memories. We didn't know because we were all far too young to know or understand about ourselves and how our emotions influences the direction of our lives and continues to do so for the rest of our lives. Remember that whatever becomes stored into our long-term memories since our very early childhood is who we become. This is the reason that in the second half of this book we are going to discuss voluntary neuroplasticity, because this is when we will all be fully aware of these brand new emotions stored voluntarily into our long-term memories. We are now going to spend a little time discussing the different complexities of our different memories. For instance, we have two types of memories, the short-term memory and the long-term memory, hippocampus. The short-term memory is also referred to as our working memory. We will be discussing the huge attributes of our working memory in much more detail in the second half of this book, because our working memory can also only function and become activated through the help of this complex natural process called neuroplasticity. But the benefits of our working memory are huge and have all of the possibilities to help us all in the future with discovering practical solutions for us all to activate some brand new voluntary emotions. In other words, we will all know that we are voluntarily helping ourselves through voluntarily activating new neurons. So let's now talk about the information that becomes stored into our long-term memories. Most of the information that we recall from our long-term memories is either implicit or explicit. The explicit memory is divided into two types of memory, the episodic or the semantic memory. The explicit memory is regarding events in our lives, and this also applies to the episodic memory that explains how we remember personal experiences or personal events in our life. This is how our brains unconsciously continue to remember our own set of involuntary childhood ego emotions. And semantic memory is based on general facts, knowledge, skills, learning, like learning to drive a car or languages, etc. And then we also have an implicit memory that is also divided into two memory sections, the priming and the procedural motor neurons. The priming memory has important significance to our own evolutionary behavioural responses. But first, let's pay a little attention to these different types of priming. For instance, we have positive and negative priming, and according to some independent scientific sources, positive priming speeds up processing in our memory, while negative priming slows down processing. And then we have semantic priming. For instance, a red rose may prime us to think of love. And then there is associative priming that links our memory to similarities such as chalk and cheese. And then we have repetitive priming, that the memory associates, for instance, a piece of music played so many times that it remains in our memory. And then we have perceptual priming, words that relate in our memory to each other, mouse and house, for example. And then we also have conceptual priming and mask priming. So you see, there are many types of different priming. However, for the sake of these very important positive emotional transformations that we are going to discuss in the second half of this book, we need to pay very important attention to these very different types of priming, because here, within this set of priming, we will find the solutions to help support all of these future positive emotional transformations. But these are simply the beginning stages of these discussions, as you will discover shortly. The procedural memory is another type of implicit memory, that is the unconscious part of our long-term memories. And between our explicit and implicit memory, this explains how, as very young children, through all of our different childhood emotional events, we unknowingly and involuntarily triggered new neurons through this natural process in our brains called neuroplasticity to generate many of our individual and different childhood, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions to become stored into our long-term memories. Because within the implicit memory lies our procedural memory that refers to knowledge of how we do things that we cannot explain. In other words, procedural memory allows us to perform tasks without us consciously being aware, and explains how infants and very young children can learn to crawl and eventually walk and talk, because all of these are procedural skills developed as young children. And this explains how we all also developed many of our very early childhood ego, fear or hurt emotions, despite the fact that, as adults, we had no conscious recollection or memory of having developed and stored these emotions into our long-term memories, and no conscious recollection that we continue to function and behave throughout our lives with our own set of adult ego behavioural patterns. But remember that our long-term memories controls our thought patterns. This is the reason that, in this next chapter, we are going to discuss, through a few very simplified versions, as simplified as we can possibly make Einstein's theories and other relativity and quantum theories, how all information that is stored into our long-term memories becomes our thought patterns. And this is how, whenever we are upset, angry, in fear, hurt, stressed, distressful, or having any other different, difficult, ego emotional wounds and suffering, our illogical, irrational, ego thought patterns rise to the surface and take over control of all logical, rational information stored in our long-term memories to become an energy. In other words, however we may think that we are in control of our ego thought patterns, our ego thoughts are sometimes in control of us, and our ego thoughts, energy, creates our own material realities, matter,